Well, things haven't changed too much since NBA draft lottery night. The consensus fourth overall pick in this upcoming NBA draft seems to still be Jaden Ivey out of Purdue. And even though there are questions still with how Fox and Ivey would fit together, is that a problem for the Kings to work out another day? Or is Jaden Ivey potentially good enough for the Kings to move on from De'Aaron Fox if things don't work? Here to answer some of those questions, talk more about Jaden Ivey, plus this entire 2022 NBA draft class. I'm going to be joined by the director of scouting for the NBA Big Board and one of the hosts of the Locked On NBA Draft podcast, Rafael Barlowe, joins me right here on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all regular season and all off season. If you're looking for in-depth analysis, game-by-game breakdowns, highlights, interviews with local and national experts, full coverage of your Sacramento Kings from January through to December, this is the place for you, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. Looking forward to covering my 9th season of Sacramento Kings basketball. This is year 5 for me hosting Locked On Kings. I currently work for ABC 10 News in Sacramento. And if you missed my most recent Locked On Kings podcast, I sat down for an interview with the head coach of Iowa men's basketball, Fran McCaffrey. He was the head coach of Keegan Murray, who I and many others in Sacramento like a lot for that 4th selection for the Kings. Seems like a great fit for the Kings. If you want more information on Keegan Murray, want a hard sell by his college coach, and just great background, great information, Coach McCaffrey was wonderful. It was an absolute pleasure to have him on. Check out that interview and let me know what you think. But I think you're also going to really enjoy this conversation today. Rafael Barlowe is no stranger to Locked On Kings. I've had him on a number of times. In fact, I had him on during the regular season a few months ago when we were expecting the Kings to be in the lottery, but not this high up in the lottery. So it's great to have Rafael back. We're going to talk a lot about Jaden Ivey. We're going to talk about what the top of his big board looks like. Spend some time talking about Paulo Banchero. There's a lot of great stuff coming for you in this interview. I think you're really going to enjoy it. We cover a ton of prospects, a ton of conversations and possibilities for the Sacramento Kings. So if you want to weigh in on anything we talk about, please do so at Matt George Twitter or Sac on Twitter. You can email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com. And if you're watching on YouTube, as you always do, get loose in the YouTube comment sections down below. But for now, please enjoy my conversation with Director of Scouting for the NBA Big Board and one of the hosts of the Locked On NBA Draft, Rafael Barlowe. Rafael Barlowe, last time we talked, it was during the regular season when we were pretty certain that the Sacramento Kings weren't going to be going anywhere, and we started taking a look at this draft class. But we weren't looking that close to the top because we were expecting the Kings, even though they weren't doing too well, to be in that 7, 8, 9 range. Lo and behold, the draft lottery, it's a lottery for the reason. The Kings, one of the luckiest teams on the night, moving up to the 4th spot. And here they are in a position to potentially nab some really, really solid talent. Before we get started, Rafael, the work that you do covering the NBA draft, you've been traveling not just all over the country, but all over the world watching these prospects. What's your overall assessment of this draft class? We hear weaker classes, we hear stronger classes. I've heard a lot of people say this is a top 3 heavy class. When we look back at the class of 2022, 4 or 5 years from now, do you think we're going to say, man, this is a really, really good draft class with a ton of talent, or outside of a few names, it's pretty average to below average?
I mean, I think it's a good class. I think that there are 4 guys that are going to be really good, which luckily for you in Sacramento, we are in position to get one of those top 4 guys. But I also think that there's not a lot of difference between, let's say, maybe pick 15 through 40. So you are going to see guys that are drafted in the late 20s, maybe even in the 2nd round, that just totally outperform their draft position. And then you're going to see guys that are in the lottery that are just totally going to flop. I mean, it happens every year, but it just seems like teams are just more interested in upside than production. And that is going to cost a few guys their jobs because, you know, you look at a guy like Keegan Murray. You can make a case and say Keegan Murray was the best player in college basketball this season. And I think Shaedon Sharpe is going to get drafted ahead of him based off of what he did in the EYBL last year. So, you know, not saying that Sharpe is going to be a bust or anything like that, but I mean, there are situations where you're going to see some of these guys that were highly regarded out of high school that didn't have good freshman seasons that are going to get drafted based off of upside and potential and not their production.
I love that you said that, me personally, because Keegan Murray is at the top of my list, the top of my board for what I think is going to be available for the Kings at 4. I don't know necessarily, as much as I like Keegan Murray, I don't know if I'd put him ahead of like a Jabari Smith Jr. or a Chet Holmgren. I might be convinced to put him in front of Paulo if Paulo were to slide. But it's the mystery of a Shaedon Sharpe, the potential high ceiling. I've had debates with so many Kings fans over the last week or 2 weeks saying, man, do you take best fit, which Keegan Murray seems to be a phenomenal fit in Sacramento, checks every box, plus is an immediate impact type player, we think, or do you go with someone like a Sharpe who has this unimaginably high ceiling, or even a Jaden Ivey, who you can see based off of what he was able to do at Purdue, the kind of player that he is, but there's questions about how he would work with a De'Aaron Fox and maybe even a Domantas Sabonis. So if you're Sacramento, you sorry, welcome to our hell. If you're us, you have a playoff mandate reportedly. You have 2 years to make the playoffs essentially, or you lose to Domantas Sabonis. Are they a team you think that's in the right position to take a gamble on a Sharpe or make a move for an Ivy who may not be considered a gamble, but might not work right away, versus a Keegan Murray who is quote unquote safer, but is more of an immediate impact player or has more potential to be like a day one starter and someone who's affecting winning basketball?
Yeah, my dream is to one day be an NBA GM. And then there's questions like this that make me say, like, wow, this is tough. Because one, if you're the general manager of the Kings, and let's just be totally honest, a lot of your pick may depend on your contract. If you have a long-term deal and you're securing it, you may take Shaedon Sharpe. If you have like a 2-year deal, then you may go with Keegan Murray because you may feel like he's the one that will help you win right away. And I mean, and this like not only impacts the city, it impacts like your family. If you're a GM, you're probably making $800,000 to a couple $1 million a year. And if you get fired because you took the wrong player that wasn't ready, then your family loses that income. I mean, so I think it's a tough decision. And I don't even know in a sense, because on one hand, you can say that Sacramento has their cornerstones. You have your 2 guys that you're going to build around, and you have pieces. I think Sacramento's in a better position than Orlando in a sense, because I don't think Orlando has a defined pecking order. I think that there's probably 5 guys on that roster that probably feel like they are the best player, at least in Sacramento. I think who your 2 guys are, and all you have to do is, I mean, really 3, if you consider Harrison Barnes part of the future. And other than that, you just have to find complementary pieces around them. So, oh man, Ivy's not the best fit. But I think Ivy, no matter where he goes in this draft, unless he falls, he's not going to be in a position where he is going to be the day one starter at point guard. So he is going to have to end up being a combo. So the fit with Fox is no different to me than it would be if he went to Detroit or even Houston, or, I mean, Orlando has too many guards. Even if he went to Indiana, it's the same position. So that's going to be a concern wherever he goes. Again, I like Murray, and I think that it's kind of being held against him in a sense that he's 21 and maybe he'll be 22 on draft day. People are assuming like he doesn't have any upside anymore. And we're talking about a guy that wasn't even a major star at this time last year, but everybody seems to think he doesn't have upside. But honestly, Sharpe scares me. He really does scare me, because I was in Chicago last week and I had tweeted some of the intel that I heard from different scouts, and nobody denied his talent. It was just like, we haven't seen him. They say he didn't even practice that much at Kentucky. So, like one scout said, and I had tweeted it, he's like, you can't hide forever. Like, what are you hiding from? Are you just protecting your stock? And I mean, it puts the Kings in a very, very, very tough situation.
Yeah. I think the Kings are in a dreadful position to draft Shaden Sharp and take that risk personally. I think of all the situations, it's the same thing almost like with hiring head coach Mark Jackson when he was in the fray. Like, do you really want to be the team out of all the teams that have said no to Mark Jackson over the 10 plus years he's tried to get back into a head coaching position? Do you really want to be the team to give him that opportunity when you've missed the playoffs for 16 straight years? I kind of look at the same thing with Shaden Sharp. Do you really want to be the team to give this young man who hasn't played a second of college basketball an opportunity in Sacramento when you're trying to win basketball games right away? It just doesn't make sense to me. So Shaden Sharp is lower on my board for that reason, but also I'm excited to see how he pans out because you watch that high school mixtape and you're enamored by some of the things that he can do. And theoretically, as a scoring wing, that's something the Sacramento Kings could obviously use.
Yeah.
There's just way too many question marks hovering around him. But Rafael, you said that you thought like the Kings are in a position now at 4 to get one of the best 4 prospects in this draft. Is Jaden Ivey the 4th amongst the consensus 3 of Paulo, Jabari, and Chet?
I think so. I think if you ask 10 people may have him at, no, I shouldn't say 10. I'd say maybe 7 out of 10 would say he's number 4. I do think there's some people that are going to say Sharp, but I would say that he is 4th on the majority of the big boards out.
Is Jaden Ivey, in your opinion, potentially good enough for the Sacramento Kings to draft him? And if it doesn't work, they move on from De'Aaron Fox?
Ooh, that's tough. I mean, on one hand, if you're Sacramento, you do not want to move on from Fox. You
Agreed.
want it to work.
Absolutely.
I mean, you lost Cousins. Then, you drafted Bagley, and I don't need to repeat who he was drafted ahead of. He's not there anymore. So you want Fox to work out. The thing about Ivey that can work with Fox is Ivey is a decent shooter from 3. And he's not a very good pull-up shooter, like, shooting the pull-up jumper off the dribble because he's like playing too fast. But I do think that he can operate well as a secondary ball handler. So, with let's say it is Ivey. With Fox, Ivey, and Sabonis, you have 3 guys that are good passers, which I think is good for your offense. The more guys that can make plays for others is good. Man. But yeah, I think Sacramento is, I think at the minimum, they're going to be forced in a sense to try to make things work out with Fox.
This episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by Rock Auto. Rock Auto is truly the #1 way to shop for your auto parts needs. Instead of going to your dealership or your local chain auto parts store that most of the time doesn't have what you need, and if they do, it's at their set price point, their set brand. You have no negotiation power. Plus, it's way more expensive. At rockauto.com, you have options, you have variety, and you can save money. We're talking 30, 50, or even 100% less than your chain auto parts store or dealership for the same parts. Like, for example, a Honda Odyssey fuel pump, $353 at a chain store, $216 from Rock Auto. That's just an example of their amazing prices that are reliably low for every single customer. They have everything you could need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Go explore their easy-to-use website today to find any solution you need to your auto parts needs. Go to rockauto.com right now. See all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in there. How did you hear about us box? So they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. What is the order of your top 3 on your board, and do you think that's how it will play out on draft night?
So my top 3, my big board, I would go Banchero, Smith. So Paolo Banchero, Jabari Smith, Chet Holmgren. How I think it's going to play out is Jabari Smith, Chet Holmgren, and Paolo Banchero.
What's really interesting is there are a lot of people that have said that exact same order for their board and the exact same order for how things are going to play out. Why do you think that is? Why is Jabari to Orlando so much of a lock, it seems? Because Jabari was, in a perfect world, Jabari falls to the Kings are throwing a freaking parade. That's probably not happening.
Didn't his dad play for the Kings too?
Yep, I think so.
Yeah, that could work. Yeah, I do remember his dad playing for the Kings. I think Orlando was ranked near the bottom of the NBA in 3-point shooting, and they have a lot of guards that like to get to the basket, and so he would open the floor up. And then, he's arguably the best shooter in the draft, and he projects to be a good defender. I don't think he's a franchise guy. I think he's a really good all-star type guy, but I don't think he's your guy that you can just say, hey, go get me the ball and get me a bucket late in games. I don't think he's that guy, but I think it makes sense for Orlando. But Orlando could also look at Chet. I mean, you look at their front office. Their front office in Milwaukee drafted Giannis. They drafted Thon Maker. Not saying that was a great choice. I believe they drafted Jonathan Isaac, Mo Bamba. So they love length and guys that can defend. So it kind of makes sense for Chet there. Also, and then with Oklahoma City, I think they're in an easy situation. Whoever they pick is is going to be a decent fit there because they have a defined pecking order at least. Same with Houston in a sense. Jalen Green is the team, but I think Sacramento's the only one that has an all-star. Mm-hmm. And I think Fox is really good, and I thought Fox showed how good he was once they got rid of Halliburton. Mm-hmm. But now it's like, all right, is he going to be in the same situation if they get Ivy? It's so many variables in this situation.
Well, he damn well better be for the amount of money he's being paid and the amount of excuses that, he was under a lot of criticism from Kings fans and Sacramento Kings media for how he started last season. Mm-hmm. But the expectations are that now that he's finally got a big man to play with in Domantas Sabonis, which he's been asking for forever, like there's no more excuses, period. Even if they do draft Jaden Ivey or another ball handler, you're going to say a rookie's going to come in here and affect the way that you play, then get the hell out of my team, get the hell out of my city, because you're not the guy that we think you are. So De'Aaron doesn't have any more excuses no matter who the Sacramento Kings draft, but still it's a conversation for General Manager Monty McNair to have with new head coach Mike Brown of, okay, we have high expectations for Fox. We expect him to still be our guy. How can we support him versus potentially handicap the team by drafting a player like a Jaden Ivey? I'm not saying Jaden Ivey is going to be a handicap by any means. I think there's the potential for the two of them to work very, very well together in the fast break, especially, but complementary styles fit. It's also always something that you have to look at in the draft itself. And that's why another guy, like, I don't think he'll go nearly as high as his 4, but like an AJ Griffin is also an interesting pick. AJ Griffin is someone who I think the Kings would have had a lot of interest in their eyes locked on had they stayed around that 7 range. Now that they're at 4, you could make the same argument that you make for Keegan Murray. Maybe it's too high to take him, even though I disagree with Keegan Murray's standpoints. But AJ Griffin, a wing, always valuable in Sacramento, a wing that can shoot, potentially has two-way potential. Like AJ Griffin is also a player that makes a lot of sense for what the Kings are trying to do going forward.
Yeah, I think so. I would even, of course, everything with AJ Griffin is going to depend on his medicals and how it tests out. I spoke to an NBA front office executive. He liked him a lot, but he just said, I have some concerns about guys that young. He's only 18 that have had multiple lower body injuries. You know what? It even makes sense to me a little bit if you're Sacramento and you're hesitant and you feel like AJ Griffin is your guy to see if you can trade back and get him at 6 or 7 and then pick up a piece. I think that let's just say the medicals check out, right? And the injuries he had in high school and last year are just, fluke injuries. To me, he makes the most sense because I think with Fox and Sabonis, you have to find them a floor spacer. Sacramento traded their best shooters away in the deal to get Sabonis. So now I think you need to find somebody that can knock down open shots. AJ Griffin shot like 45% from 3. At one point, he was making like 50% of his threes. And I do think that because he got off to a slow start in a sense, because he got injured early in the preseason, by the time he was ready to contribute, Duke was already rolling. Mm-hmm. So I think he played a limited role and he settled for this corner 3 specialist 3-point shooter. I definitely think he has more to his game than he was able to show. And if he ends up being like this 40% 3-point shooter that can also put the ball on the floor and defend multiple positions, I think that's a win for Sacramento. If I had to just go by fit alone, he's the guy that I think would be the best choice for Sacramento.
Another guy that's building a little bit of momentum, at least among Sacramento Kings fans here, is Benedict Mathurin. What do you think about him? He's another guy that if the Kings were to get him, they'd probably trade down in order to get him. But he's a guy that's captured a lot of the attention of fans here in Sacramento. What do you think of his overall game and how he could work in, theoretically, Sacramento's system?
Yeah, I think at the very minimum, he's a 3-and-D wing. He's a good shooter from three. Not a great shooter, but he is a good shooter that projects to be a good shooter. The key for him is if he can continue to develop a little bit of his ball handling and passing, then then I think he can be more than just your 3-and-D guy. But I think at the minimum, he's your classic guy that, I mean, I don't want to compare him to like Dorian Finney-Smith, but I could see him at the minimum playing that role as a valuable guy that defends, knocks down open shots, gets some offensive rebounds here and there, just kinds of serves as like this great complementary piece that makes life easier for the Stars. But if he can add on the ball handling, which he did make some strides as a ball handler and pick and roll player as a sophomore, if he can continue to add that, then I mean, we could be talking about a guy that could potentially be like an all-star type player.
Locked On Kings is also brought to you by Truebill. This is an absolute must-have app today's day and age. It helps you with budgeting, helps you manage your money, and does you the amazing favor of canceling unwanted subscriptions and keeping track of unwanted subscriptions. The reason why companies and free trials renew without your consent, it's to play on your forgetfulness. It's to play on maybe even your laziness. They get your money out of you half the time without you knowing. Truebill takes care of that problem for you. Plus, some companies make their subscriptions really hard to cancel. Truebill will cancel it for you with their incredible concierge. I use Truebill now for all of my budgeting. Immediately, as soon as I downloaded Truebill, I was able to cancel over $150 a month worth of subscriptions, and I'm not alone. There are so many people who on average save up to $720 a year with Truebill. Go to Truebill.com right now. Use promo code LOCKEDONNBA. Download their app, and you can be one of the 2 million users saved over $100 million. Don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling today. Truebill.com/LockedOnNBA. Going back to the top of the draft, Paolo Banchero, he sounds like he's the most likely to slide out of the top three out of any of them. If Banchero does slide to the Kings at 4, is it a situation of you just take him and say thank you very much? Or do you think the Kings have consider other guys ahead of him, even if he falls to that spot?
Well, I'm a little bit biased. I've been riding the Banchero bandwagon all season long, and I would take him number 1. So if Sacramento ends up in a position to draft him, you have to take him. I think most people are overthinking what Banchero is. He's 6'10". He can handle the ball. He can score inside. He can score outside. There were some concerns about his three-point shooting. He shot over 40% from three in the NCAA tournament. He can create his own shot. Again, he did not really showcase his full arsenal as far as like being able to play point forward and point center and at Duke because they had other ball handlers. But in his high school tape, you know, I'm not a fan of like going by a lot of guys' high school tape, but he played a little bit different because he had the ball in his hands. And even at Duke, he showed some flashes of his passing. He had a couple games where he had 6 assists. And I think that would be a great fit, in my opinion. I'd go to a Sacramento Kings game in Sacramento if they got Banchero.
Interesting. You think Banchero would be a good fit? Because I've heard concerns about defensively, question marks with how he and Sabonis would play in a front court defensively. Neither is necessarily known for their shot, although both are working on their shot and have potential to. Banchero certainly has more potential to improve his 3-point shot than Sabonis does at this point in his career. What about those two, and what about the Sacramento Kings makes you think, oh, Banchero with the Kings would be really, really good?
Well, I think with a creative coach, I mean, you can run some 4 or 5 pick and roll, right? So Sabonis is a good passer. So I'm thinking of times where, you know, you can run a 4 or 5 pick and roll, and then you have 2 guys that if they get the ball in the middle of the floor, they can make plays for others at the corner. They can score. I think another guy, Banchero would give the Kings another guy that can post up. So I think like, I mean, this is like my dream scenario, and it's one of my dream scenarios in a sense, but you know, you look at the playoffs now, and I think Banchero is more ready to contribute. So you look at how Dallas is winning games in the playoffs. They are playing bully ball with their wings, even their guards. So if you have a guy that can't defend someone that's stronger, they are picking on you, right? So if you have a Banchero and Harrison Barnes, you got 2 guys that if a team switches a guard on them, you can take them to the block. And with Banchero, if you send a double, he can pass. He can make the interior pass to Sabonis. He can pass it to Barnes in the corner for three. I just think that he would be like this weapon that a creative coach, and I mean, Mike Brown hasn't been known to be a creative coach, but I think he's kind of been put in a box because he coached LeBron, and there's usually not a lot of creativity in the LeBron-led offense. But I think a creative coach can like really maximize his skill sets and what he does. And so, again, this is probably a bad comparison, but one of the things that makes Golden State good amongst all their pieces is that you can run like a Steph Curry, Draymond Green pick and roll in the middle of the floor. And when Draymond gets the ball in the middle of the floor, there's so many things that he can do as far as making the pass to the corner, as far as finding like a lob threat. And I think Banchero can do a lot of the same things as far as like if he's the roll man, whether he can score, he can shoot the pull-up jumper, he can find guys. But I'm a little biased. I'm high on Banchero, and I would take him number 1 overall.
A lot of the things we talked about when we discussed this draft during the regular season, we talked about the possibility of the Kings trading this pick. And had they stayed at 7, I would have been very surprised if the Kings didn't make some move involving that pick to bring in more NBA established talent to help this team get to where they're trying to go. There still is the possibility of that with 4, but certainly a lot harder to move that pick for the value you expect for that pick than for 7. Even 3 spots has a massive difference in terms of trade value. So it seems less likely that the Kings will be able to find a deal like that unless they're trying to move up or move back in the draft. And there's a rumor going around that the Kings are interested in moving up to 2 and trying to get that pick off of Oklahoma City, willing to give up a future first rounder, maybe even next year's first rounder in order to get that done. Is that something you think the Kings should heavily consider? Is the difference between 2 and 4, in this case, probably a choice between Paulo and Chet Holmgren versus Jaden Ivey or the scraps left over? Do you think that is a good enough move for the Kings to take a gamble of trading away one of their, what more often than not ends up being a top 10 lottery pick?
Oh, that's a tough question. Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I guess it depends on how much they like who's ever going to be at number 2. I mean, I just sold Banchero. So if they feel like that's the guy, then yes, I would make that move. Even with Chet, you could say like, all right, well, if there are concerns about Sabonis on defense, then Chet is supposed to be able to clean that up a little bit. I do have some concerns about Chet and concerns about his size, but more so of how do you maximize his size? Like, do you play him at the 5, where I think he's going to struggle? But if he's at the 5, then he's your best pick and roll defender. Or do you play him at the 4 where you use him as like a weak side shot blocker? But if he's just kind of not patrolling the paint, then are you really maximizing what he brings to the table defensively? Because if he's playing the 4, then he's going to end up guarding like, stretch 4s, guys that just kind of stand out and shoot 3s. And I don't know how, I mean, it doesn't maximize everything that he brings to the table. So I think he's kind of tough to build around. But another factor with Chet is I think he's the one that's going to sell the most tickets. And so at the end of the day, the NBA is a business first. And so if you're Sacramento and you draft Chet at number 2, I think he's going to generate revenue, big revenue up front. And sometimes that's what owners care about. Of course, they want to make the playoffs, but I think the fans and social media have more impact on drafts than we think. Not necessarily with like general managers, but I think with owners. So, and that could be a factor. But if I were the Kings, it just depends on if there's a guy that they feel like is a lock. Like if they really, really like Jabari and you move up to 2, you're still taking a risk that Orlando takes him at number 1.
Right. And you honestly may not pull that trigger until you see, maybe you wait on draft night, Orlando takes a Chet or Apollo, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, now we're willing to pull the trigger and move up to get Jabari. That could be a scenario that Sacramento's waiting on as well. Draft night's going to be interesting regardless, because the order of this draft can be thrown on its head immediately, which makes it really exciting, Rafael. But
you know what I'm looking for on draft night?
What's that?
what Matt George is going to do on draft night. You have to top what you did last year.
I don't know if I can. I don't know. The king of tanking might be retired or dead at this point. Like last season was a murderous experience for many of us here in Sacramento. We're hoping for light at the end of the tunnel finally after 16 years of this crap, Rafael.
You got a month. You got a month to decide what you're going to do to top last year's performance on the Locked On NBA Live Draft Show. I was in the studio cracking up when I saw that. So that's one of the things I'm looking forward to seeing. So no pressure on you, though.
Well, depending upon how the draft goes, it might just be a video of me jumping through my window, glass and all, and just letting it all. It's a single story, so it won't be that far of a fall, but sometimes it feels like the only logical decision to make from a Kings fan standpoint. But before I let you go, Rafael, again, I talked about immediate impact players. Which players in this draft do you think can have not necessarily a day one impact, because that's really tough to expect of a rookie, but which players in this draft do you think can really affect winning basketball and can be pieces that can get a team that has been, or help bring a team that has been on the cusp or outside of the playoffs for 16 years, actually make enough of a difference to get them into that playoff picture that Sacramento is looking for?
I'd say right away, I think Jabari can, just because I think he can end up being like a generational shooter at his position. So I look at like the Kings, if you have Jabari, then now you get Fox and Sabonis, that floor spacer. Now with Jabari, and let's say it is Harrison Barnes, you have two guys that you can't leave open. Now that Sabonis and Fox pick and roll becomes really dangerous. So I think he could impact them from day one, push them over the top. I think Banchero could, just depending on how creative the coach is. I think Keegan Murray could also. I think he's ready to come in and play right now, and I think he could help win right away. I mean, I don't think the Kings are far off, to be honest with you. And I'm not saying it's just because I'm on the Kings podcast. I think that they are close. I don't know if a rookie kind of gets them over the top, but it could also be coaching. It could literally, it's not a fair comparison, but we've seen how Boston just couldn't really get over the top in the East, and now they bring in Udoka. And think about if you're Danny Ainge, you left that Boston job to go to Utah, and now the Celtics are a game away from the NBA Finals. Or if you're Brad Stevens, you move up to the front office. I imagine he wishes he was coaching a team going to the finals instead of looking down from the big chair. But if Mike Brown can have the same type of impact that Udoka had, and of course Udoka, his goal was to get them to the finals. Mike Brown, his goal is he just has to get them to the playoffs, which I think is a little bit easier. And you get the right coach and you get the right rookie, then I think it can happen.
I know there's a lot to unpack in there with my conversation with Rafael, and big thank you to him for joining me on Locked On Kings. No matter what the Kings do on draft night, we absolutely will have him back on. Ton of stuff about Jaden Ivey there. A ton of stuff about Paulo Banchero. There's just so much for you to unpack from that conversation. If it's changed your mind at all on any prospects, changed your mind on what you think the Sacramento Kings should do with the 4th overall pick, let me know at Matt George Sack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com. Leave your thoughts in the YouTube comment section down below. Again, go check out my conversation with Iowa head coach Fran McCaffrey if you haven't already, about Keegan Murray. Check out all the amazing interviews that I've done here on Locked On Kings really over the last couple of weeks, trying to pump out as much content as I can for you building up to this draft. And I have more great guests coming, so don't you worry. Also, I'm still doing the giveaway. I will be buying a pair of tickets to opening night for the Sacramento Kings, lower bowl tickets to opening night that I'll be giving away if we get over 350 reviews on Apple Podcasts. We're currently close to 330 or something like that. So we're going to reach this goal. Just help us reach it sooner rather than later. Looking forward to treating a pair of Kings fans to some opening night tickets. Really hope that I'm able to do that and meet you there at the Golden One Center. Should be a great time. I can't wait to see who is going to be playing for the Kings at that time. This roster is probably going to look different. Who will be the rookie on that team? Will the Kings even have a rookie, or will they trade the pick? All questions to be answered. And no matter what happens this offseason, we have it covered for you right here on Locked On Kings. Appreciate you listening today. Can't wait to have you join me next time. Until then, my name is Matt George. You have been listening to the Locked On Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.